Over
And
sheets of
the
foot of the Spanish steps.
That's right.
Or you can consult the Pope.
Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm pretty sure there will be a few additional folks coming, but since this event is being webcast, I'd like to be halfway on time and welcome all of you to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to this Cold War International History Project seminar and book launch. So welcome our steady stream of viewers through the web. I, as always, will get several emails after this session from around the world of people complaining the volume was too low, or just simply saying that they had a chance to check in with us through the web. I'm Christian Osterman, director of the Center's History and Public Policy Program, as part of which the Center runs the Cold War International History Project, has done so, as many of you know, for almost 17 years now. We collect, translate, publish evidence from former communist bloc archives, and we're actually going beyond that these days. We have a small fellowship program and organize smaller and larger meetings here and around the world, and occasionally try to provide a forum here in the heart of Washington for the discussion of new important evidence and publications. And such a publication, I think, we're going to discuss here today, Lorenz M. Lüthi's The Sino-Soviet Split, Cold War in the Communist World. Let me just briefly introduce our two speakers here. We have, of course, our author here, Lorenz, to my far right, who is currently an assistant professor of History and International Affairs at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and author of the aforementioned The Sino-Soviet Split. Lorenz worked with John Gaddis and others at Yale University, from where he received his PhD, and he also has the equivalent of a master's in History, Political Science, and International Law from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, where he grew up. He's also a frequent contributor to Cold War Project conferences and publications, and in fact the current issue of the bulletin that's sitting at the printer right now has a edition of documents by Lorenz, features some of his documents. We have the great pleasure and privilege today to have with us as co-panelist and commentator on Lorenz's presentation one of the doyens of the field, Warren Cohen, with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And he, of course, is also a senior scholar with the Woodrow Wilson Center. For many years ran the Asia program here, and for even more years has been a member of the Cold War Project's advisory committee, and in that capacity has on numerous occasions been of great advice and help to me here at the program. He is the author and editor of 11 books. Just a printout of his publications on the Library of Congress website, runs several publications. I can't mention them all, but do let me remind you that he is one of the co-editors and authors of the Cambridge History of American Foreign Relations. He's published widely on U.S.-Asia relations, including his classic account, America's Response to China, as well as more recently, The Asian American Century, and America's Failing Empire, U.S. Foreign Relations Since the Cold War, published in 2005. It's with great pleasure that he is joining this panel and that we have him back here at the center. I'm going to turn it over to Lorenz for some introductory remarks, 20 or so minutes, and then Warren will comment on, provide his commentary, and then I hope we can fairly quickly throw the floor open for discussion, comments, questions by you. I think we'll go until about certainly no later than 5 o'clock. So with that said, welcome. Please turn off your cell phones. And Lorenz, you have the floor.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And thank you to Professor Cohen for actually his willingness to comment on the book. The book is brand new. This is the first time that I actually speak about it to the public, and it's also the first time that I see it being sold. It's a really nice feeling, especially it being the fact that this is really the first book I have written. When I asked what I should present, I was basically told maybe 5 minutes about the genesis of the book and 5 minutes about the contents and maybe a little bit about how it fits into the larger context. And this is what I tried to do. Well, it is, as I said, the first book. So it originally was, in fact, a dissertation. And somehow, like 10 years ago, I was confronted with the problem of actually now picking a topic about which I should write a dissertation. And this might be interesting to the graduate students here, the way you should select actually a topic. First of all, I decided I want to write a topic that a Cold War history in which the United States really didn't play a role. Around 10 years ago, most of the Cold War historiography was still largely US-centered. And I mean, this is quite logical because American documents were those that were mostly accessible. Still around 10 or 15 years ago, the Cold War International History Project started really to publish translated documents. So I made the decision, I want to write a story where the United States doesn't play a role. Well, it didn't work out that way, because in fact, even in this story, the US plays a role, but a much smaller one than most of the earlier historiography actually claims. Then I also wanted to write a dissertation that forced me to travel wide and far, paid by my university. That's maybe a pretty good idea for those graduate students sitting here on the right. Pick a topic that basically encourages you to travel and to ask from your university to give you some more money. Now, finally, I also wanted to write a dissertation about an important topic. Too many dissertations are about small topics, and this is often, I think, due to advisors saying, well, this topic is too big, write about something small. I was very lucky in having 3 advisors who let me do what I planned to do. Although they later told me they never expected that I would succeed. But at least they allowed me to do what I wanted to do. And in fact, I think I did not a bad job in the end. Now, the interesting thing is I had no clue what I was actually setting out. I had no idea what kind of evidence I would get in China or in the former Soviet Union. I knew that I would get some Soviet materials in East Europe. This turned out to be actually probably my most important source of evidence. The problem with my topic was that a lot of people had written about it, especially in the 60s and early 1970s, but very few had actually any access to documentation. The first one, the most famous one, is Donald Zagoria's book, published in 1961, and he obviously had access to CIA documents. And these documents have now actually been published, released and even published a couple of years ago. And I remember getting these documents, and I remember reading them, and I remember saying, the CIA really got it right. They were writing my dissertation 40 years ahead of me. So, to a certain degree, Zagoria got many things right. However, he couldn't get everything right because he published it in 61. And it's my conviction that by 61 the split is not yet really there. Now, what I decided to do when I set out writing my dissertation is just to bypass all the old literature and just leave it aside and just try to approach the new evidence with an open mind. Well, some of you might think now this is really irresponsible and I shouldn't tell your graduate students to do that because you should first know the literature and then you should do research. But I do think so that in this particular case this was the right thing to do. I did talk with several people at Yale about what their ideas are about the Sino-Soviet split, and I remember one political scientist, and I don't say that in order to bash political scientists, but one of the political scientists says, of course they have the Sino-Soviet split had to occur. Look how long their border is. The longer the border, the more likely it is that the two countries are going to war. Well, that's probably also the reason why Chile and Argentina are continuously at war, I guess. So I knew that there was something wrong, and so I felt quite well just not to look at it. That doesn't mean that I had preconceived ideas about the Sino-Soviet split. I actually was convinced at the very beginning that the Soviet Union was the more guilty part or more responsible part. I never used the word actually guilt in the book. I talk about responsibility. And I believed that because I thought it was the more powerful country, and as the more powerful country, in fact, the Soviet Union should have actually cared better for the partnership. I also was raised by a mother who had grown up what became East Germany, and she was staunchly anti-Soviet, and I probably was influenced by her views. And I was then really surprised to read, to figure out, looking at evidence, that it's really Mao who is pushing for the split. And it's not that I get this from Soviet documentation. Much of the really damning evidence is actually coming from Chinese publications, from Chinese memoirs particularly. So I did find that quite interesting. I was also convinced, having looked a little bit at Zagoria, that the split basically was there in the early 60s. And I only realized while I was doing research that the story really goes until 1966. That 63 to 66 is an important story. However, I do think from 66 to 69, when the border clashes occur, there's nothing substantial new that contributes to the story. And I don't think so that the border clashes are really a part of the split. They are a consequence of the split, but they are not a part of the story itself. I also did not think at the beginning that domestic politics really mattered. This is something that really surprised me, how much domestic politics actually influenced the story. Now, what are the causes for the split? Primarily, in my view, it is really ideology. This is nothing new. Other historians have made the argument that ideology really matters for what used to be the communist world. So what I, however, was surprised by is to the degree by which ideology really mattered, especially for Mao. In the fields of economic development, where the first conflict actually emerges, already in 1955, in the field of de-Stalinization, which Mao takes as an important ideological issue, starting in early 1956, in the field of roughly in our world revolution or peaceful coexistence, where a conflict really emerges, probably by 1959. Mao was really key to all these conflicts. And what surprised me is that it is Mao, that this is a man who really was breathing ideology. This is the more surprising when you consider that Mao, in fact, is one of the least trained ideologues in the party. He was actually a revolutionary practitioner in the 20s and 30s. He came very late, actually, to the field of ideology, to the field of studying Marxism-Leninism. And but what I think what is happening over time is that ideology becomes a kind of a crutch for his worldview, because he is actually not a very well-educated man. And ideology then takes up a kind of a substitute for the lack of his general education. So I really think Mao is central to the story. Now, many of you might now actually be twitching and want to raise your hands and say, wait a minute, what about security? Because this is an argument often brought up by political scientists who make really the argument that the Sino-Soviet split is about diverging security needs. It's not about ideology. That's only window dressing. I mean, this is how the Sino-Soviet split rhetorically plays out. Most of them point towards the issue of Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait crisis and say, well, after 1954, 1955, when it was clear that the Soviet Union was not actually extending the nuclear umbrella over China with regard to Taiwan, there were really diverging security interests. And I have not found any evidence in Chinese sources that Taiwan was a major issue until the late 1950s. In fact, when it comes to peaceful coexistence, the Chinese at the very beginning were actually quite welcoming to peaceful coexistence. They thought that this was a way of actually recovering Taiwan. There was not a dispute over security. It, of course, turned later into a dispute over security once the ideological disagreements had emerged. In general, I think all the other factors, although they play a very important role, are only exacerbating existing ideological conflict. This is security, this is territorial disputes, personality conflicts. Look at Mao and Khrushchev. Both of them were really very difficult people to work with. They were strong-willed, very self-confident, had their own convictions. But I don't think so that these are the roots of the conflict. They are just exacerbating the conflicts, the ideological conflicts once they emerge. And this leads me to the question, was there anything to avoid this split? Once the ideological conflict emerges and becomes really bitter, was there any chance of actually avoiding a final split, this bitter confrontation? And I have thought about that long and hard, and I write about that in the conclusion. And I don't think so that anything could have been done after 1959, roughly late 1959. And these are just my thoughts given from what I have seen in the evidence. By late 1959, China basically didn't need the alliance anymore. China had gotten everything from this alliance it wanted. First, security, in order to deter the United States at the very beginning. It got military aid, it got industrial and economic aid. But by 1959, Soviet aid actually was running out. We have to keep in mind that Soviet aid never was an open-ended commitment. That was very clear from the beginning, that this aid was there just to jumpstart Chinese development. And China was supposed to become militarily and economically and industrially and so on, actually self-sufficient. 10 years into the alliance or 9 years into the alliance, it was clear that China would not get much more from this alliance. In fact, China at that point was saddled with a lot of obligations as a result of this alliance. Especially they had to repay the Soviet Union, had to repay largely in raw materials and in agricultural products, and some semi-finished products. So to a certain degree, there was nothing more to get, but there was still more to give from a Chinese point of view. It is at this time an ideological conflict really has emerged to a degree where Khrushchev and Mao, when they meet in early October 1959, that's the last meeting, are on such bad terms that they basically yell at each other at this meeting. Actually, Mao doesn't really speak, Chinese speaks, but Chinese yells at Khrushchev and Khrushchev yells back. So they are not even actually on talking terms, they are only on yelling terms by then. For Mao, it was clear now that the Great Leap Forward had turned out to be a disaster, and that he was actually challenged at home for leadership. Whether this was a real challenge or an imaginary challenge in Mao's head is difficult to say. I think it's probably Mao feared that he would be a challenge that his imaginary rivals would actually move against him. And here, the domestic politics and the international relations aspect of the story then merge, because what Mao now does, he's micromanaging the collapse of this alliance over the following years, in order to serve this, in order to make this collapse serve his domestic needs. He starts to smear the former ally for ideological failings, in order to be able to tie his rivals also to these failings, and so that in the end he could go actually after his rivals once he had established that in fact the Soviets were the greatest danger to the socialist future. So I do think after 1959, without Chinese domestic politics, we cannot explain the split at all. Now, let me briefly maybe talk about how this book relates, to any future research, I think, not only to mine. I mean, first of all, to mine, it is a project that naturally gave birth to my next actually book project. And here I'm more interested in, to look at the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and to look at the rise of the post-Cold War world during the Cold War, and to see how this emerges slowly in East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And my central argument is that without the Sino-Soviet split and the subsequent reintegration of China into the world, and this is the initiative comes from China, it doesn't come from the outside world, that this is, for me, a natural continuation of the current project. And I don't see this project necessarily as a result of the Sino-American rapprochement. I don't think so that the although I'm now speaking here in the United States, and I know that I might actually offend some people here, I try to push the Sino-American rapprochement a little bit into the background, because the story is about China opening up towards the whole world, of which the United States happens to be a part, although a very important one, I agree. But the opening towards the world really starts much earlier. It starts in the early 60s with an opening towards Japan. It starts with an opening to West Europe, to Canada. And it's, in fact, when you look at the opening, the United States seems to be a little bit a latecomer when you look at the sequence of events. I think more importantly, what this book, or what I wanted to do with this book, is also to raise awareness that we should take domestic politics really seriously when we study international relations. This idea that states are black boxes and that there's some kind of a uniform foreign policy behavior regardless of the internal setup, regardless of ideology, regardless of personalities, seems to me wrong-headed. I think China is the best example. Mao's China after 1956, during his last 2 decades, is the best example how domestic politics influence foreign policy behavior. And I do know that other people are actually working in a similar direction. I do know one dissertation that has just been finished at Yale on North Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, makes precisely the same argument, that we cannot understand North Vietnamese behavior without actually understanding the internal issues in North Vietnam. So at this point I might stop, and again thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Lorenz. Let me also add congratulations on this accomplishment. We're here to celebrate the publication of this book, but we never celebrate here at the Wilson Center just in terms of backslapping, but also in terms of a good discussion and a critical discussion. And I can't think of anybody better who would be qualified to do this than Professor Cohen. Warren.
Thank you, Christian. That prepares everybody for the bloodletting. But I have to say it's not going to come today. That I would have to begin by complimenting Professor Lüthi on his extraordinary use of Russian and Chinese and other archival sources and memoirs and writings of various sorts. I never had those language skills, and I never had the energy to pursue evidence in so many disparate places. And I found his research for this just tremendously impressive. And I must say, I'm envious. I can't start over, it's a little too late, but I just wish that when I was his age I could have done half as much as he seems to have done for this book. Now, I take it a step further. He talked about putting off reading the secondary literature. But don't let him fool you. He didn't put it off for very long. I was also struck by his superb grasp of the secondary literature, which I find so rare in young scholars who too often rediscover the answers that their elders provided 30 years before. At a conference in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, Rod McFarquhar, Alan Whiting, and I were sitting in the back of the room, bemused by the wide-eyed analyses of some of the participants who were reporting essentially the same things that the three of us had published about the time they were born. And after a while, Rod couldn't take it any longer, and he demanded the floor. And he got up and asked those young people if they would please have the decency to wait until we were dead before they overlooked our work. Now, this is definitely not the case with Professor Lüthi, who demonstrates a command of the literature that I find rare among young scholars. This is a very mature work, a magnificently detailed narrative of the Sino-Soviet split. And assuming that it will be a very long time, if ever, before we get any more out of the Russian archives or the Chinese archives, I expect this book to be the standard reference work on the subject. Whatever is known, almost certainly whatever can be known today, can be found in this book. I do have some questions, especially about Professor Lüthi's contentions about Mao's motives for many of the actions that he took. You know, we rarely have evidence of motives, and we can't always be sure, even when an actor purports to tell us why he acted. On the other hand, the basic rule that I recall from graduate school, and I can't remember that far back, is that if an argument is not contradicted by existing facts, it must be taken seriously. And so I would say that every conjecture offered by Professor Lüthi is at least plausible, at least possible. I should note that he has even considered several alternative explanations for Mao's behavior and woven them into his narrative. Well, as he just indicated to you, he stresses the role of ideology in the split. He insists that ideological disputes over economic models, de-Stalinization, and peaceful coexistence really mattered. That ideology was not merely a cover for other issues. But he also makes it clear that ideology had a role in internal politics, especially those of China. And one could say vice versa, that internal politics had a role in what was put forth as ideology. As you probably noted, he is dismissive of security concerns such as Soviet and Chinese differences over policy during the 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis, dismissive of explanations focused on conflicting national interests and of nationalism, and he downplays the personality clashes between Khrushchev and Mao. I guess what delighted me most was his dismissal of the influence of the American wedge strategy in creating the Sino-Soviet split. The importance of this wedge strategy, our friend and colleague John Gaddis has exaggerated shamefully for many years and poisoned the field. I hope that he will read his student's dissertation and book very carefully and correct his errors. Maybe a self-criticism is in order for John. Nonetheless, Lüthi concludes that ideology alone is not enough to explain the split. And he does a brilliant job of demonstrating that specific internal political conditions led to the manipulation of ideology, to the instrumental use of ideology. In the end, he seems to provide an argument that I like very much and allows me to question the idea that ideology was the critical variable in the split. After pointing again and again to Mao as the principal instigator of this split and of referring to Mao's use of ideology and his use of the split in China's internal affairs in order to retain power for himself, to serve his domestic agenda. After noting Mao's megalomania, he asks a wonderful counterfactual. I've never seen anything quite like it, and I loved it. What if Mao was not there? What if his parents had separated before his conception? And that leads me to conclude that the critical variable was always Mao's megalomania, and that ideology was rarely more than instrumental. Again, a magnificent book, especially so early in Professor Lüthi's career, and I look forward to reading that next book that he's talked about. I hope I'm still around and you don't wait 10 years to get it out.
I hope not.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions, comments. And now,
shall I briefly respond?
Sure. Why don't you go ahead and respond to Professor Cohen's?
Well, first of all, I wish you had been one of my readers and you would have actually raised these questions early on. I know that these questions are coming. Briefly about Russian and Chinese archives. This is already a joke among my friends. Once they're open, then I have to write actually the second edition, which I hope I'm not going to do. I hope somebody else is going to do it. Because despite the fact that it's an important event, one of the things is it's actually a depressing story. And this is something which I also want to tell our grad students. When you pick actually a dissertation topic, pick a topic where you have at least one person you can genuinely admire, because that's the person that is going to carry you through all the years of research. Don't have actually just a pantheon of people who really are not nice people. It's really depressing in the long term. And so I'm not going to write the second edition, I'm quite sure, at this point in my life. Maybe I'll change my opinion in 5 years. About Mao's motives. First of all, wedge strategy. Gaddis, is actually quite open about criticism of his own work. And he actually did like this in the dissertation a lot. And it was never an issue of, you have to tiptoe my line. He actually encourages his students to prove that he is wrong, and I think that's one of the
when
great
he knows
qualities.
I'm in the program, he encourages his students to push the wedge strategy.
Okay. So I want to talk with him, once he has read the final product. Now, domestic politics. Your argument is, to a certain degree, you make this point that really it's Mao. That without Mao, this would have not happened. I completely agree that I think after 1959, Mao is the central figure. And that then as an extension of your argument, you say it's the manipulation of ideology is really only in instrumental terms. I completely agree that he instrumentalizes ideology, and that's also what I write. But I also think that at least until the late 1960s, Mao is a true believer. And I think by the late 1960s, he starts to ditch the ideological pretenses in the context of the Cultural Revolution going really off track, where he realizes that he is really in the dead end. And I think this is I always make this argument. I hope I get actually evidence for that in my next book, that he becomes a much greater pragmatist after 1968, 1969. And there is some evidence in 1968 where he sends out actually orders to clamp down on the use of ideology, to clamp down on this infamous slogan, Beijing is the center of world revolution, which he himself had coined actually in September 1963. So I do think in the end he is de-ideologized. But I think this happens really in the last years of his life, and I hope I will get evidence for that. I don't think so that in the early 60s, this is already the case. But we might actually here disagree on, the precise date. Okay.
Thank you. Let me abuse the prerogatives of the chair, ask perhaps the first question following the commentary, and just ask Lorenz to talk a little bit more about his sources. I think they're important factor in this study, and I'd like you to just talk a little bit more about this, given that you're at the Cold War International History Project.
Okay. That was also one of the reasons. I mean, what the other reason was just simply space. For a first book, you can't write a 1,000-page book, and it's already 400 pages. I didn't add a bibliography. This is online. But I decided to write actually an essay on the sources, which I think is more useful in this particular book for those who want to figure out something about the methodological problems. I did research in archival and secondary sources in China, Russia, Poland, Germany, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, Italy, and the United States. So I saw archives from the inside in all of these countries, and I accessed published sources in several languages. The fundamental problem, and this is, to come back to this issue with the Russian and the Chinese archives, is that we really don't have access to the central sources, that is to the number one archive in Beijing, where we would have, let's say, Politburo transcripts or the Mars papers or journalized papers and so on. And we don't really have access to the same set of documents on the Soviet side in the presidential archives. That used to be open, but it is not open anymore, even to senior Russian historians. I mean, some of them manage via the back door to get documents. This is also the way how it works in China. But for this, I'm way too junior, and I'm neither Chinese nor Russian. So I could use largely, in case of China, I used extensively a really large memoir literature that has been published. And this falls basically into two categories. A smaller category of memoirs that were written very clearly on the basis of documents, where for pages original documents are quoted. It's quite obvious. And then to a much larger degree, just memoirs that were written as memoirs, how people remembered the past. All of these, however, have to go through quite a bit of self-censorship, because you cannot really openly write very critical accounts of even Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution. And there are obviously also published sources. On the Soviet side, the number of memoirs is much, much smaller. I could actually work in the Foreign Ministry archive, and this was probably the most useful archive on the Soviet side. In the case of China, I worked in a provincial archive where I got even Politburo transcripts that somehow ended up in this archive. We can also talk about the problems, the pitfalls of these archives. But I knew very early on that the Soviets were trying to mobilize the East European allies, and that they were sending a lot of material to these fraternal parties. And I systematically went to these archives, and there you also had records on international conferences. You could go to the Foreign Ministry archives there and get actual reports from the embassy from let's say the Polish embassy in Poland, in Beijing, with reports about a talk with the Soviet ambassador in Beijing. And you wouldn't find actually the Soviet ambassador's report in Moscow in the archive, because he probably sent it through party channels to the party archive, which you can't access. But at least you can get a kind of a copy of that report in the Polish Foreign Ministry archives, or in the East German Foreign Ministry archives, or in the Bulgarian Foreign Ministry archives. So there you can get quite an amazing amount of information out of these fraternal archives, including actually the Italian party archives. The Italian Communist Party had an enormous apparatus, a foreign policy apparatus, and it sent representatives everywhere, and they actually wrote reports in Italian. Their Politburo meetings, or the meetings of the Direzione, are the most fantastic meetings, because they actually really discuss things. They even, because they are in a democratic system where you have to discuss and convince the other side. You have actually discussions where somebody reports from a visit in China or Vietnam, and the question is, can you please explain this? Can you give us more details? And so you get actually quite detailed information about China and Vietnam. these are largely the sources I used. I hope, of course, that in the end we will get access to the important sources in Beijing and Moscow. But I think this will take a long time still.
Thank you. We had a couple of people. I think you were first. And if you could please wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation so we can capture your response, your question or comment for the people on the web right here. Christina.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. I can't help but be curious whether you're following the relationship between Beijing and Moscow now and all the technology transfers and so forth. But my real question is, you said that China had gotten all it needed from the relationship. I wondered if that applied to nuclear weapons. Of course, the test by the Chinese, their first was in 1964, I think. Had they gotten all that they had really wanted by the time that the schism occurred?
I, of course, do follow China and Russia at the time, but I have to say that the context is very different. So the story is also a different story. And the ideology doesn't really play a role anymore. These are now really realistic interests on both sides that drive their relationship. Now, the other thing is what you said, that China got all it needed. Well, maybe I was imprecise. China had gotten by 1959 all it could expect to get. It could still get more, but the Soviets made it quite clear at one point that their resources are also limited, that they are not a self-service store that has indefinite supply, and that at one point the Chinese also had to stand on their own feet. Now with nuclear weapons, this is something where I think I could not get out much more than has been previously known, written by the Xue Litai and John Lewis' book on China Builds the Bomb, which is now 20 years old and is still actually quite up to date. The Chinese are very, very secretive about their own nuclear weapons project, and there's not much more information about that. What I can tell you is the Soviets provided an awful lot of technology that was necessary to build the bomb. And they promised even to provide a Model A bomb that then the Chinese could actually reconstruct, and then that bomb had to be shipped back to the Soviet Union. So they basically a copy. Now, they never did that. They actually reneged on that in 1959 for various reasons. I think the most important reason is that in 1958, when the Chinese initiated the Taiwan Strait crisis, the Soviets got second doubts about the reliability of this ally. However, several Soviet advisors at the time said that this was the worst decision you could take. You basically had provided everything short of a nuclear weapon to the Chinese, and now you end the assistance, and by doing so, you actually also lose all the supervision and the leverage. Because up to then, there were always Soviet advisors and specialists involved, but now you cut them off from information, and now even the Soviets don't know what the Chinese were up to. Largely, I think it didn't really had a great impact on the Chinese nuclear weapons project. It might have delayed the development of the first nuclear device of October, I think, 16th, 1964, maybe for a couple of months or a couple of years. But the Chinese had all necessary to build this nuclear weapon. It was a matter of time, basically, to get it together and to get it working.
Thank you. Thank you. Gentlemen all the way in the back.
Thank you. I'm Michael Yehuda. I used to be at the London School of Economics, and now I'm at George Washington University. I have a number of comments. One is the remarks you made about political scientists. Well, I don't think of myself as a political scientist. I think of myself more as a student of politics. But I've heard many historians say what you say, and obviously the counterpart that people on the political side say is that historians are prisoners of their archives. Mm-hmm. And I think there's arguments on both sides here. But I think the more important issue is about Mao as an ideologist. Clearly, Mao spoke in ideological terms. But I think if you... I haven't had the advantage of reading your book. Doubtless, you must have taken account of the writings of, say, Rod McFarquhar, Fred Tevis, Ross Terrell over here, who have long pondered why it is that Mao exercised such a dominance over his colleagues. And here, I think, archives will not give you an answer. Here you have to go into the realms of those who have thought long and hard about the nature of politics. And the fact that you may find your archives written in ideological language does not necessarily mean that Mao was spending his time being an ideologist with a clear position on theoretical matters. In fact, one of the puzzles of Mao is why he was always able to surprise his colleagues. His colleagues never knew where they stood with regard to him. And it seems to me, if one is going to say that it is ideology which is the key, then it should seem very strange that those who were closest to him, those who perhaps had known ideology better than him, those who were actual students of Marx, those who were students of Lenin and everybody else, somehow or other were continually caught off guard by him. And that applies to domestic politics as much as to international ones. So, as I say, I wait to read your book, and I'm sure I will learn much from it. But I think you are too quick to dismiss the writings and thinkings of those who are concerned with various aspects of political science.
Well, thank you actually for the questions you raise, and the introduction I gave was 50 minutes for 397-page book. Obviously, I cannot bring in all the shades. I think you bring up, all the points you bring up are valid, and I have read obviously the books you mentioned. I know I have talked actually with Professor McFarquhar twice about it. And I think he has seen the manuscript. That's at least my feeling. Now, you're completely right that archives don't tell you the complete story. I do understand that. And I did try actually to understand how Mao functioned as a leader and what his relationship to his colleagues are. And I think I also try actually to work this out in the book. To portray how he actually controls information and how information flows to him and how it's actually flowing from him to his colleague. That he was the man who really controlled the information flow when it comes to foreign relations, when it comes to the most important decisions, especially with regard to the Soviet Union. I also think it's really important to see that a lot of his power doesn't really stem from his control of the party. In fact, he doesn't really control the party. It's really charismatic leadership, and it's the personality cult and how this personality cult was constructed after 1945, how it gets an inner dynamic, how this allows Mao Zedong to basically set the agenda time after time. You mentioned that a lot of his colleagues had no clue where he stood on ideology, although they were much better trained. I think there are numerous examples in my book how he changes the agenda of Politburo meetings in order to surprise his colleagues and set a completely different agenda and basically turn around decisions. I have thought, I think, hard about the way how Mao functioned. And Roderick McFarquhar's book is a great contribution to this book, and I have explicitly, I think, over half a paragraph of thanks to him actually in the introduction. So I hope you will be satisfied when you read the book. However, you make the argument that many of his colleagues were much better trained in ideology, and I completely agree with you. But that does not, in my view, undermine the fact that Mao was a hardcore believer. You can have an incomplete understanding of ideology, but still be convinced that you really understand ideology. And I think this is the problem with Mao. He was convinced that he understood it, But I mean, we all know that, in fact, he, as I think Leszek Kolakowski once said, that Maoism is, what is it, potatoes compared with Stalinism, or Stalinism in comparison with Maoism, or Stalin looks in comparison with Mao like a very powerful theoretician. And when you know that Leszek Kolakowski, a couple of chapters before, basically trashed Stalin, then you know that he didn't really look at Mao very kindly. I do, in the introduction, I talk about ideology and how I see ideology. I have not found a lot of good explanation how ideology functions within a political system in the literature. So I decided basically to disregard the literature as there is and to make it up by myself. And I see ideology in two ways. One is really as a belief system. Even if your understanding is incomplete, it can be still a true belief system. The other way, I can see it also as a tool system, that you use ideology, especially in the case of Marxism-Leninism, where you have so many ambiguities and internal contradictions, where you can use the one theoretical claim in order to basically try to discuss away another theoretical claim that is in the canon of ideology. And Mao was very good at doing that, at basically exploiting these ambiguities and turning the tables often on his much better trained colleagues. I also think that occasionally, but not always, he uses ideology for very personal reasons, for personal gain, where it is in fact a rhetorical weapon. However, I find it very, very difficult to really distinguish all these gradations, and it's just a matter of judgment. I have a couple of instances where I'm absolutely sure that Mao Zedong is a true hardcore believer. One is the decision to introduce the socialist high tide, collectivization basically, where China was facing basically a structural economic crisis. And they were discussing the issues that are on the table. And Zhou Enlai proposed Titoist ideas, Chen Yun obviously Bucharinite ideas. And Mao Zedong really pushes through his ideological answer. Non-ideological or non-socialist forms of dealing with this structural dilemma, didn't even cross his mind. To say, okay, maybe we should actually free up the economy, we should introduce market mechanisms, didn't even cross his mind. He was so wedded to, the Soviet model and its various formations throughout history that he only saw that as a solution. So I think this is a very hard case where ideology really guided his decision. In other cases, I hope we have the opportunity to talk about the book once you have read it.
Thank you. Warren, would you like to chime in?
Well, I can just give you a couple of quick anecdotes about how Mao got away with what he got away with his colleagues. I was doing a series of interviews in Beijing in 1986. I find it painful to think of how long ago that was. And I talked with one senior figure who had started out as one of Zhou Enlai's many secretaries and had accompanied Zhou in most of his diplomatic missions and then ended up heading one of the research academies. And he said he had always believed that Mao was infallible, that anything Mao said had to be right, that anything Mao wanted to do had to be right, until Mao turned on him and said that he was a rightist. And then suddenly, for the first time, it occurred to him that maybe Mao wasn't infallible, maybe Mao wasn't always right. I relayed that story to another senior scholar who had earlier in her life been Mao's interpreter, French interpreter. And she smiled wryly and she said, even when he turned on me, I continued to think he was right. And how does a figure get away with that? I wish I could do that with my children.
Thank you. The gentleman right next to Professor Yehuda. Why don't we take a couple of responses? A couple of questions. And so, gentleman, Rostero, right there. Yeah. So, first you.
I'm Viren Prakash from New Delhi, author and columnist. I'm not clear what exactly was the ideological divergence between Soviet Union and the Chinese. Particularly, I thought you are focusing on Mao being gunning for some kind of peaceful coexistence with the West, whereas the Soviets were not. Is that, if that understanding is right, then I have a question. What was the basic ideological divergence that made them go that far apart? Was it that he was gunning for, he wanted peaceful coexistence? I mean, Panchsheel they had declared with India a long time back. I mean,
in
a few years back.
Yeah.
But that could have been just window dressing. Yeah. Or that could be for a regional supremacy, regional... but if it was something else, then
Panchashila is one form of peaceful coexistence Mao actually promoted. The Soviets then later, 2 years later in 1956, promoted actually peaceful coexistence with the United States. And initially, to make it very short, initially the Chinese actually did see this in the context of Panchashila. But once a conflict emerged over the Taiwan Strait, actually Mao was even renouncing peaceful coexistence, and in fact renounced Panchashila in 1959 with the Sino-Indian border war. And then he didn't want to have anything to do with Panchashila, with peaceful coexistence. So he was actually the hardliner, whereas the Soviets were actually willing to find a sort of rapprochement with the West.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman back there.
My name is Ross Terrell. I'm presently at the Wilson Center. Two very interesting talks. As a biographer of Mao, I agree with you that without Mao, the split wouldn't have happened when it did, as it did. I think he was a true believer, but the question is, what did he believe in? He said the great leap forward was economically a mistake, but not politically a mistake. That's a very ideological position to take with you to his deathbed, as he did. And just before he died, he said one of his two great achievements was the Cultural Revolution. Now, none of this means that he was a believer in orthodox Marxism. There is a sequence, I think, which you basically implied, a chronological sequence in the split. It's domestic politics first for Mao because he was disturbed by the attack on Stalin. Personality differences between Khrushchev and Mao were not nearly as important as the fact that Khrushchev had attacked Stalin in 1956 and Mao's colleagues were grumbling at him in China. Second was what you call the national security issues, including some you didn't mention, Khrushchev's non-support for Beijing on India and how to deal with the USA and so on. Third, the ideology, and I agree with you, it's very hard to separate those two. But then there's the border clashes in 1969 where things move to a different level when you're fighting wars, and from the Chinese side, domestic politics comes in again in the last phase as it did in the first, because though there's a lot we still don't know about the clashes on the Amur and the Ussuri, it had a lot to do with Mao and his defense minister not seeing eye to eye anymore. Finally, there's a puzzle about Mao and ideology. When, as Michael Yehuda said, he kept surprising his colleagues, when he surprised them first, Mao was taking a very orthodox Marxist position. Khrushchev was talking about peaceful coexistence. No, we've got to be anti-imperialist and so on, the inevitability of war. But then the next time he surprised his colleagues, in the mid-60s, he was saying the American problem is finished. They've wounded themselves in Vietnam, and the Soviet Union's more powerful. And this, of course, was the line of thinking in Mao's mind that led him to the deal with Richard Nixon. Now, how can they both be Marxist positions? Well, the first one, yes. The second one, I suppose you could argue, there was a residue in Mao's mind that a capitalist power is ultimately feet of clay. And somehow he really did think that the US economy was weak and that the Soviet Union was going to eclipse the United States, and so he disagreed with his own colleagues and said after Vietnam we'll make a deal with Washington.
Thank you. Lorenz?
There are a lot of questions, wrapped into one greater question, and I mean, we could talk about that here at length. And of course, I want you to read the book, so I will be very short. Briefly, national security. You mentioned India and you mentioned the border wars. They are in the book, and I don't deny that they had an influence on the split. But my argument is that by then you had already a fundamental ideological conflict out there on economic development, on destalization, and even on peaceful coexistence. Once these territorial or border conflicts emerge, they just actually push in the deteriorating relationship further down actually the road. But they are not the initial causes for the deterioration, because by then so much ideological disagreement had already emerged, and it was already on the verge of becoming public. And these were fundamental issues they were discussing. They were discussing in the whole socialist camp. This was a discussion throughout the socialist camp, including other states, including Poland, Hungary, Albania, Yugoslavia. This is not that all of them are window dressing in order to cover actually the Chinese and the Soviets for what their real conflicts are. These are genuine disagreements that are lurking and are often also, I think, not there in the open to us looking from the outside on the story.
Thank you. We have a number of names on my list. So I'd like you to be very brief, very to the point with your comments and questions, and I'll ask the same of our speakers here as well. Dr. Masny.
Yeah, Wojciech Masny. I have two questions. You made a very good case that by 1959 the split was irreversible. Would it be fair to say that neither the Chinese nor the Soviets realized that? My question is, at what point did either of them regard the conflict as irreversible? In my view, the Soviets by 1963 only, by the summer of 1963. About the Chinese, I would like to ask you. The second point about the lack of likable characters in the story. Would you be prepared to make an exception in your next book and at least see someone who had redeeming features, such as Deng Xiaoping?
Thank you. We'll go to the gentleman right there.
Okay.
Hold on. We'll take a couple
Okay,
of questions just to make a little progress here.
My name is Stephen Shore. There is what I call the geostrategic point of view that the circumstances under which Mao came to power were fairly unique, that the Chinese had a memory of what they considered Russian encroachment on their territory, and if the timing was not foreordained, it was probably very likely that China would not remain under Russian authority for long, regardless of who was in charge of China. And the other point is the generational aspect, that that Mao was the first, China was the last power in 1956 to have become communist, and that's still true today. And Mao was the first leader, whereas Khrushchev had the experience of his successors. And so, if there was never anything like Khrushchev's little red book, but there were mobs of young people holding Mao's red book, which, if it doesn't strike us as ideologically coherent, nonetheless, that Mao's China was certainly more of what we would call a faith-based initiative than Khrushchev's Soviet Union, and that this generational aspect also made a break very likely.
Thank you. And we'll go one more question here to Yiqing.
My name is Yiqing Chen. I'm from University of Maryland at Baltimore County. I have a question about Mao. In your speech, you said Mao is not a very educated man. I'm just wondering, what's your definition of a very educated man? And by saying that, do you suggest that if Mao is more educated, the ideological conflicts between China and the Soviet Union will not be as big as it was?
Thank you. Lorenz.
Okay. I have just Wojciech's questions. I personally do think that looking back late 1959 is a watershed. Now, when did actually the participants think that the split is not irreversible? Now, China, in case of Mao in late 1959, he says, once Khrushchev is gone, and Khrushchev will fall anyway because he is an ideological traitor, and then real communists will be back in power in the Soviet Union, then we will get together again. However, Khrushchev falls and basically nothing changes in the Soviet Union except on Vietnam and agriculture. And then he realizes that he basically had miscalculated. And I think then he realizes that there will be actually no reconciliation. But he always has this idea in his mind that in the long term, once imperialism is attacking the socialist camp, it will actually come together again. So there's the long-term hope. In the case of the Soviet Union, I think you're right, late 1963 is probably correct. However, already in 1960, I have Khrushchev saying, when I look at Mao, I see a second Stalin. So there is quite some concern early on that this is going to be a major problem. Maybe one that you can solve, maybe not. Deng Xiaoping, he actually, the problem is with all the historiography I use, the Chinese language one, is that it's still very Mao-centered, and it's really difficult to get a feeling of how Deng Xiaoping is actually acting in relation to the Sino-Soviet split. He definitely comes across as a hardliner ideologically during the Great Leap Forward, but then he switches side, and then he's probably suddenly an economic liberal in the early 60s. I still cannot get a full grasp of Deng Xiaoping as a figure, and whether I can see anything sympathetic there. And what I can see when I look at anybody that is sympathetic in the book, it might be actually the Soviet ambassador to China, Chernovenko, who actually seems to have been really a pragmatic person and one who really knew, was a decent person as well. Maybe he comes closest to a redeeming character in the book.
Both Ezra Vogel and I are writing biographies of Deng Xiaoping, so your answer will be out there soon.
Okay.
Excellent.
Russian encroachment, Sino-Soviet alliance. I think you asked this question. There was never a question of the Soviet Union really having authority over the PRC. This was a voluntary alliance China wished. And China made it quite clear from the beginning that, yes, there was Soviet advice, there was Soviet input, but China would make the final decisions on all kinds of decisions. Yes, virtually every alliance historically, is collapsing at one point. NATO is probably the one big exception. So you could also make the argument at one point the Sino-Soviet alliance, even without Mao and without Khrushchev, without Stalin or whatever, would have collapsed. But I think that's not the point of the book. What we have to explain is, why is this alliance collapsing so quickly and in such bitter terms? And I think we can explain this only because Mao is there. And I think that is also what I write very early in the introduction. This is the fundamental problem of the story, not that this alliance collapses at one time, because even the Chinese, I think, from the very beginning saw this as a temporary alliance designed to restore China to former glory and former greatness. But I think they didn't envision in 1949 that 15 years later this alliance was dead. Generational conflict. I think there is a generational conflict going on, largely because what Mao is doing in the late 1950s is what the Soviets were doing in the early 1930s. And when the Soviets look at China, they see basically Stalinism, the great terror, and they are scared. It is very clear from the little evidence we have from Khrushchev that they really, at the time when the Soviet Union tries to overcome the worst of Stalinism, Mao is launching China into the worst of Stalinism, and I think there's definitely a generational issue there. The education of Mao Zedong. What I mean with education is formal training. This was a man who read a lot, there's no doubt, and we have also quite some information on what he read. He read very eclectically, but he was not a very well trained man who actually could step back from what he read and try to think about that in more abstract terms. His understanding of ideology of Marxism-Leninism was, I think, really underdeveloped, and I think he is on record saying in late 1959 that this is the first time in my life that I read anything about Stalinist economics. That's a man who launched the Great Leap Forward, which was supposed to revise Stalinist economics. I mean, that tells you a lot about Mao and his level of education.
Thank you. I have on my list Professor Brzezinski, Don Oberdorfer, the gentleman up front here, and right, you, exactly. And Anton Wolfensberger. So, and I think we'll close with that round. And so, please, Greg.
I'm Greg Brzezinski from the George Washington University. I was just curious, how do you see the Third World fitting into the Sino-Soviet split? In particular, there are differences between Mao and Khrushchev and the Chinese and the Soviets over how to handle the problems of decolonization in Africa and other parts of the world. Are these differences, are they a cause of the split, or are they a function of the split? I'm curious how you see them working in. So,
thank you. Don Oberdorfer?
Actually, I'm like a guy, at a raffle who kind of blinks because I didn't ask to say anything. I found it very interesting, but I had no question I wanted to ask.
Wow. Very good. Very much. Okay, Don, go ahead.
Mine, too, was related to the Third World. I was in Tanzania at 67, 68. They had embraced sort of the Chinese collective thing as their African socialism under Nyerere, but we had the Chinese then building the north-south railroad. We had Chinese doctors and nurses in Dodoma, where I was as a Peace Corps volunteer. My students would bring back Mao badges on their lapels and little red books and so on. But I'm just wondering how you saw both the Soviets and the Chinese competing in different ways for sort of the leadership of the Third World.
Here, up front here. Right here. Right up front here. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. Murray Marder, Lehman Foundation at Harvard. Do you touch at all in your book, which I have not had the opportunity to read, on the gross misunderstanding by both the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations of the Sino-Soviet split and even in its simplest form? And the reason I ask that is to see whether you have provided any guidance to us on how that fundamental issue became such a driving force which drove the United States into the Vietnam War.
Thank you, and we'll go for the final question to Mr. Pillsbury there.
Can I just tell you lost your wallet, not
yes,
that you actually, leave it here, yeah.
Hi, Michael Pillsbury, scholar in the basement of the Pentagon. My question is very similar to Murray Marder's about your findings on the American understanding of the period you cover, but I have the opposite point of view. CIA has declassified quite a few studies, and they claim this is one of the success stories that in particular led the President Kennedy to ask about nuclear defanging of China. There's an article in International Security which goes through all the declassified documents, but there's a history in the Eisenhower administration as well, and there's something called the Solarium study. But there's a history of trying to exploit the Sino-Soviet conflict based on intelligence analysis of what was going on. This seems to be a success story from what I have read. Jim Billington, our current Librarian of Congress, actually is a hero to me, because he's one of the very first to write a paper at CIA, now declassified, with his name on it. But there were several others by Arthur Cohen. Did you have a chance to look at all this? And is Murray Marder right that it was a terrible misunderstanding by the Americans? Or am I right that the CIA deserves praise for what it did?
You came in too late, Mike. He already told that story at the beginning.
Sorry, I withdraw my question.
I said, once I actually did get the declassified documents and I read them around maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago, then I just realized that, the CIA had basically written my dissertation in the 1960s. So I do think that they actually did get it right. that they really understood, and probably they had moles, and I hear they had moles actually in the Latin American communist parties who, basically brought all the information from the Bucharest meeting in June 1960 to the CIA and so. And this is why Zagoria also in many respects got the story right until 1961 when he publishes the story. But then the story is not over. That's my argument.
Do you rebut Murray Marder then? Is Murray Marder saying that the Kennedy and Johnson administrations got it all wrong?
Well, the problem is that I don't think so that the Kennedy and the Johnson administration, and this is not a part actually of the book, because as I said at the very beginning, I didn't want to have the United States really dominating the story, because it's a story between China and the Soviet Union. And this is not a part of the book. But what I gather is that at least the CIA got it right. But the problem is, what do you do on the basis of this correct information? How does that actually how is it turned into policy you can really implement? And in the end, if you then look at these documents, and in your back you have the Sino-American rapprochement, it always takes two for a tango. You cannot tango alone. And even if the Americans wanted, the basis of this documentation sought for rapprochement, and Schulzinger has written an article, Robert Schulzinger, about the Johnson administration looking at this. The problem is that this is the time when the Chinese are under Mao's leadership are becoming ideologically more and more radicalized. And this is the run-up and the early phase of the Cultural Revolution. You needed the other side also to respond to any signals you might have sent out. And this seems to me an impossible assumption that this was possible. This also leads me to the story: is how much is the Sino-Soviet split, the American and the American escalation of the Vietnam War actually tied to each other? The Soviets repeatedly accused the Chinese of putting up obstacles for aid to China, and by doing so enabling the American escalation of the Vietnam War. However, I have not done this research by myself, but I had a couple of really good students, and I teach a Vietnam War seminar, and I asked them, why don't you just write actually a seminar paper on this issue, on did the Americans escalate the war because they saw that there was disunity in the socialist camp? And from the information and the evidence, they saw that this is not the case. That the Sino-Soviet split, the disunity within the socialist world and the inability of the socialist world to support Vietnam was not a reason for the Americans to escalate the war, thinking that this might be now an easy war because North Vietnam wouldn't get that much aid. There's no evidence for that. Not yet. Maybe there is evidence out there, not yet declassified, but I haven't seen anything. Now to come back to Greg, decolonization and national liberation. Of course, in very general terms, Mao always saw China as a part of the so-called intermediate zone, what he defined the intermediate zone, over which the two Cold War superpowers were actually fighting. So in a certain degree, there was always, by association, a sympathy towards national liberation movement and to the issue of decolonization. You have this wave of decolonization in Africa around the late 50s, early 60s. This comes into a period in China where Mao is shunted a little bit to the sideline as a result of the Great Leap Forward. And I think to a certain degree he uses the fact that there's a wave of decolonization going on in Africa to wrest himself back into the supreme leadership position in China. And he instrumentalizes this idea that now, after China is almost completely isolated in the socialist camp, except for Albania and Romania and North Vietnam and North Korea and I think Indonesia and the Maoist splinter party of Belgium and New Zealand. And after basically China had lost sympathies within the socialist camp, that the national liberation movements in Africa and partially in Latin America and East Asia might be now the natural constituency where China could turn to in order to lead world revolution. So there is, on the one hand, an instrumental and a contextual reason. However, I don't think so that it really adds to the story. to my story I want to tell. Because I think a lot of what Mao talks, when he talks about we have to support national liberation movements in Africa, is largely there for internal consumption. And it's this instrumental use of ideology. He wants to portray himself as the true leader of the anti-imperialist revolutionary forces in order to gather credibility at home. And the other problem is that many, not all of them, Tanzania is the big exception, and there are a couple of other African states, but many of those who actually African states who had established relations with China in the early 60s, suspended or even cut them by 65, 66. Because what Mao in fact is doing, he's telling them, look, you have just undergone the anti-imperialist revolution. Now what you have to do is you have now to reintroduce the socialist revolution in your countries. And basically he's turning against these post-colonial leaders he considers to be bourgeois leaders. And of course these leaders are the leaders who had the governments with which China had actually established relations. So by basically now trying to attack these post-colonial regimes, he's undercutting his own support, especially in Africa. But this is anyway a very interesting story. A very good graduate student should track down how actually African states reacted to Mao's rhetoric. I think this is completely understudied. And I looked at the literature, and most of the literature is from the 60s and early 70s, and then we have basically nothing.
Okay, Professor Cohen? No, very good. And I'd like to conclude this meeting with thanks to our two speakers and congratulations to Lorenz on the publication. I believe the book's available at a discount.